Thanks for joining us on the GovIT podcast, TechTrends Highlights Special Episode Number 2. Today we're going to cover our overview of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, Parts 1, 2, and 3. And I want to welcome everybody to the first of a three-part series that we're going to do on the new White House National Cybersecurity document that was released in March. There are a number of pillars, as they're called in the document. And I think, so in this episode, we're going to cover pillars 1 and 2. One is defend the American people, homeland, and way of life. And pillar number 2 is promote American prosperity. So I have a couple of questions right out of the gate. The first one is, before we dive into some of the content of the document itself, what exactly gave, was there something that, besides the obvious, concerns these days about cybersecurity and, digital attacks and things like that, was there something in particular that gave rise to this document being released when it was released?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the $1 billion that they're putting into a fund for cybersecurity strategies for local and state government. And then also just kind of creating a framework that all federal agencies can use as kind of the default to build upon. Cybersecurity strategy that they put together, has the approach at securing like the national digital infrastructure, and kind of responding to the cyber threats that are kind of in focus on the main objectives that they put the pillars to. So all four of them: defend, promote, preserve, and expand.
So let's dive into the first pillar. Defend the American people, homeland, and way of life. What does that entail exactly?
Well, yeah. So, that's kind of set up to really kind of safeguard the digital ecosystem that we have in place. It kind of involves the federal networks. So you're going to see a lot of, push for FedRAMP, and then, mudging all of the DoD side of the house, which, was really kind of the military deployment guide. So it puts all the security restrictions in place as the default. And then there's the critical infrastructure that we have. So that's everything from especially on the DOE side. So power plants, nuclear power plants, especially, things of that nature. So really it's trying to create a solid foundation so we can support the American public. It kind of enhances, the current cybersecurity practices that are in play, as well as kind of empowering the American people with the tools to prevent, issues themselves. Okay. So a lot of education will be coming your way as well.
Right. How does the strategic plan enhance federal government security?
Yeah, so it kind of focuses on centralizing a lot of the standards. So once we have those standards centralized, then it's a lot easier to start building upon. So, every agency has a certain method that they're going to go produce their cybersecurity efforts, put things in place that are going to be the baseline. And then that really kind of improves, if there is an incident, how do we detect it? How do we respond? And kind of increasing the accountability of all the different agencies.
What are some of the key elements in securing the infrastructure against cyber threats? This is such a huge concern these days.
Well, there's a lot. The strategy kind of outlines the approach of, from the government standpoint and the private sector to really work together, which I think is very important.
How does this strategy aim to empower the American people specifically in terms of protecting themselves online and our contribution to national security?
Well, it's, I kind of see it as the strategy almost from the ground up, kind of raising the public awareness of the different threats that we have.
So moving on to pillar 2, promoting American prosperity. Can you give us an overview of this pillar and exactly how that plays into the overall strategy?
Yeah, this is really kind of, fostering the innovation.
So with the rise of concerns over digital threats, can you tell us more about how the strategy aims to secure the digital economy specifically?
So it kind of, promotes the cooperation between government, private sector to kind of mitigate the risks associated with the complexity that we haven't put in place, the global interconnectivity. So even if you think about that piece, we have agencies that, have offices all across the world. Mm-hmm. So there has to be some type of interconnect to connect those offices together. Putting that partnership in place, the global supply chain is very important to protect, just kind of develop more secure, resilient, trustworthy networks to support the supply chains are very important right now. So kind of working close with the allies, and our private and public partners.
Is there anything included in the strategy, or is this part of the coverage for digital economy that would allay some of those concerns?
It's a big part of that. Especially when we're talking about the power network and the grid, protecting that. That's very, very high in the list of things that they're going to be able to start really focusing in on to protecting. Because if you look at what happened to other countries when there was an invasion, there was definitely attacks on the power grids.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition that we're experiencing. The all the great benefits that come with things going digital, and the conveniences also bring some of these vulnerabilities that I think is a large part of what this document is looking to address. How does the strategy plan to promote trustworthiness and an open internet, which is also a pretty big concern these days?
It is. And it really kind of emphasizes the importance of working with our international partners, kind of uphold that vision of an open internet, free, global, reliable, secure
Mm-hmm.
internet. A lot of those words are, when you put those together in a sentence, it's hard to do,
Right.
especially when you want to secure it and have it open. What are those guidelines that you have to put in
Mm-hmm.
place? Really kind of promoting the responsibility to have a behavior that's good in the cyberspace
Mm-hmm.
arena is important. To be accountable, collaborate with other nations, to really kind of to put something meaningful in place, to augment kind of the malicious cyber attacks. And that's a big concern across the U.S. and all of our allies.
Why don't you give us first a brief overview of Pillar 3, which focuses on collaborating with the private sector to secure critical infrastructure?
Pretty much says it. I mean, that's what the pillar is about. It's the collaboration between the U.S. government and the private sector. So really, it involves a lot of sharing of information between all parties, kind of building the partnerships, providing assistance, especially for the critical infrastructure owners and operators. Kind of how do we enhance the security posture?
How does the strategy propose to strengthen the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies' capabilities in this area?
Well, yeah, so it proposes kind of to be able to strengthen the cybersecurity infrastructure security agency and kind of give them the capabilities that they're looking for, to add additional resources, some additional authority.
And the document also mentions establishing a cyber safety review board, also called the CSRB. Can you
Correct.
explain what that board will do and why it's essential to the strategy?
Yeah, so that was kind of created probably a little bit before the Log4j incident. So that was their first kind of realm into getting together and kind of talking through a big cybersecurity related issue, and it's head by a DHS department. So it's kind of really at that point going to be spread against all government agencies. So putting together kind of post analysis what you should be able to be put in place across the government platforms, so that type of security will not be penetrated again.
So, well, let's move on to Pillar 4 and talk a little bit about how the strategy covers, ensuring that the United States remains a leader and a global leader in cyberspace.
Correct. And then, with that kind of thought, it, really kind of invokes the promoting of having a stable and open internet. What our country's kind of built on is the openness and freedom, and then kind of building those coalitions between the like-minded countries, and then holding the malicious actors accountable. So when somebody from the outside does kind of come in and has a big cybersecurity threat, how do we as a nation kind of go through and find out the root cause of that and find the actors and hold them accountable for it? So that's all kind of part of that Pillar 4 process.
I would imagine that involves a pretty significant amount of collaboration with international partners, right? Because with an open internet, we have to have collaboration and cooperation with global players in order to keep it open but secure at the same time, like we talked about last time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different international cooperations that we're engaging with at this point. So everything from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Quad Critical and Emerging Technology Working Group, Trade and Technology Council. So the U.S. does plan on providing a lot of development into those organizations. So we all have kind of the same principles and responsibility across the board.
So one of the things that we're talking about here, has to deal with, the security of behaviors in cyberspace. And one of the key concerns mentioned in the document is the risk posed by untrusted suppliers, right? So we're not just talking about users and other various kinds of bad actors, but untrusted suppliers in the digital ecosystem specifically. How does the strategy propose to mitigate this risk?
Well, it again kind of goes to that collaboration between the public and private sectors, because their one is to kind of create a little bit more secure, resilient, trustworthy supply chain. So by doing that, you're going to have some of your, suppliers actually be on the state side. So developing those critical technologies domestically is very key. I think we saw a lot of those issues, happen during the pandemic when we couldn't, just on supply chain, just gathering up the chips, et cetera. So kind of investing in those initiatives, as well as open radio access networks, which really kind of penetrate within the 5G space that they're looking into, just provide more secure, telecommunications infrastructure across the board.
And I think there's mention of the Telecommunications and Information Administration being involved in this effort. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they'll really help with kind of the adoption of the open, the interopt piece, and assist with the standards, on the network side for the protocols.
So I think this takes us to the elephant in the room when it comes to the subject of cybersecurity in this day and age. How do we protect, or how does the strategy propose to address the challenge of protecting sensitive data in cyberspace from foreign adversaries?
So it really kind of points to two executive orders. The first one, securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain, as well as protecting Americans' sensitive data from foreign adversaries. So what they're doing is they're trying to prevent unacceptable and kind of undue risk to our national security by safeguarding information and the communication technologies, services, from the other governments, that might have influence on us. So overall, it's the overarching framework that needs to be put in place. And a lot of that has to do with what they do with these individual kind of groups within the government, putting together their frameworks and their strategy in place on the cyber side. So we can easily bolt that on across the nation from all the different agencies.
One of the things that I've always run into, being involved in technology for almost 3 decades professionally at this point, is that everything we do is a constantly moving target. Do you feel like the strategy, as in its current form, is really, does it have the kind of agility and flexibility or scalability, I guess, to evolve at the kind of pace that we need for the to match technological advancements?
Well, that's a great question. Now, I do think with the new kind of agencies and ecosystems that have been put in place, that will help in the future to kind of be able to migrate those strategies into the new type of strategy that's going to be coming out. No matter what's get put in place now, you see a public framework and strategy that's going to be something that's documented, but has taken 24 months, let's say, to actually go from hey, we got the idea, let's go and publish the framework, to being published. Then that's going to be out of date in a certain period of time.
Right.
So it's going to be a constant yearly, every 2 kind of cycle to keep up with that.
This is the third of a 3-part series. Today, we're going to be doing Pillar 5, where we talk about implementation, assessment, and investment aspects. So let's start with the implementation of the strategy. Who exactly is responsible for implementing the strategy?
Yep. So the strategy is from the Office of the National Cyber Director. So he's responsible for coordinating the strategy's implementation and working with the interagencies and all the partners to, provide the outlines that are necessary, that make sure that they meet the federal, guidelines that are set in place, kind of perform on that executive strategy. You also have the National Security Council in there as well, that kind of goes over the policies. And, they also work with Congress on the strategy as well.
What would such a plan look like? What are the goals and objectives specifically of the plan?
So there's a lot of, it's more of like a framework type of set to make sure that agencies are meeting at least the bare minimum requirements from the federal, guidelines that they put in place.
When you say it's a data-driven approach, what are the data that are being collected, and how do those relate to quantifiable outcomes? I mean, do we know what some KPIs are going to be?
Yeah, definitely part of the process. At this point, it's kind of getting that framework out there, the requirements, and setting up new projects. So everything on the federal sales cycle, it does take a while. And you got to understand when it goes out to bid what those requirements are, and you build your frameworks, to those requirements.
And as I'm sure the plan is being executed, data is being collected, there will be a lot of lessons learned. What would be the role of the cybersecurity review board in that process?
It's really going through kind of the auditing piece of, once an incident occurs, how did the incident occur? What can we improve, moving forward? What needs to be put in place within the frameworks? Really having that as a process so it gets distributed across the board between all the different agencies. So if there's, some kind of an emergency cybersecurity threat, that they can put those processes in place, those recommendations, and move forward, as well as just anything that's going to be put into the framework holistically moving forward as well.
So this brings us to the next big topic. What investments are going to be necessary to maintain a secure and resilient digital ecosystem?
Well, this is the one thing that really kind of stuck out to me, going through the whole article. And it's really the strategy, puts a lot of emphasis on generational investments. which means this is going to be a long-term play, kind of coming from, yearly funding that's probably going to, increase, which at this point, from everything that I see, that's definitely needed and required.
What's the plan for working with Congress to fund cybersecurity? I know we touched on that a little bit already, but can we get into some more details about what that's going to look like?
Yeah, well, because cybersecurity and the ecosystem itself is just rapidly evolving, kind of learning what the new threats are, how to mitigate those threats, what needs to be put in place. So you're kind of staying ahead of the game the best they can. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the partnerships and kind of working with Congress to make sure that the funding is there to keep up. This is kind of one of those things. If the funding is not there, government's just going to kind of stale out, and then we're just going to be open to cybersecurity threats left and right.
Does the new national cybersecurity strategy go into issues around artificial intelligence much?
A little bit. Really touched on that. I would say within the last couple of weeks, I've seen a lot more focus in on that. It's a little bit more high-level. I mean, ChatGPT kind of is throwing that into the forefront. Mm. What do they need to do? How do they need to protect it? What's coming down the pipe and how do they deal with it? So all those things are being discussed. I just haven't seen a framework that actually will outline anything useful at this point.
Thanks again for joining us today on the GovIT podcast, Tech Trends